and she'll obviously introduce herself more. Thanks, Kelly. Yes, so Coco will be our moderator for today's conversation. Coco has worked at Mama Cash since 2019. She joined as the grants manager and has led the institution through its PGM transition. In 2022, July, Coco became the director of programs. And prior to Mama Cash, she served as the campaign and communications manager at the Global Network of People Living with HIV, GNP+. Coco was born and raised in New York and is a proud graduate of City University of New York. So if you have some OGs and people who have attended the institution, feel free to connect with Coco here or in the chat or after here. But yes, that's a brief overview of who Coco is and who will be moderating our conversation today. I would like to welcome you, Coco, and hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Gloria. And thank you, everybody, for joining this panel. It's sort of good morning for some of you, I'm sure, good afternoon and good evening. It is really my privilege to be here in the space and to be moderating what I think will be a really, really interesting and rich conversation. Again, by way of introduction, as I know Gloria has done, I am the Director of Programs at Mama Cash. Mama Cash is one of the world's first international women's funds. Its headquarters in Amsterdam, which is where I'm based. And Mama Cash provides core funding, flexible and long-term, up to 10 years, to self-led feminist activists, networks, organizations, and individuals who are advancing the rights of women's, girls, and trans and intersex people's rights. So a few years ago, as Gloria mentioned, Mama Cash made the decision to fully transition into a participatory grantmaker. At that time, many donors told us that it was going to be too risky, that shifting power and decision-making to communities themselves wouldn't work. But of course, we did it anyway. We were buoyed by, of course, this community of folks, and we were very much encouraged. And now it has been transformative internally from Mama Cash and externally in terms of the way we work and the granting partners that we support. So it really was a huge impact on our organization, our institution. So this webinar talks a little bit about that and about civic participation. And before I begin, I want to sort of put forth a kind of simple but profound question. And that is like, what happens when people closest to a problem are the ones who control the resources to solve it? And this question sits at the heart of participatory grantmaking, as we all know. It's grounded in the belief that people most affected by injustice have the deepest knowledge and experience about the issues that they face, the strongest incentives for change, and often the most sustainable solutions. So what we see when this shift happens, whether it's in our institutions, whether it's in our communities, we move from being treated as beneficiaries of philanthropy to becoming the actual decision makers. And that is where civic participation begins to take a deeper and more structural meaning. So today's conversation is just about that. It's not only about philanthropy and grant making models, it's about what's possible, it's dreaming when communities are actually trusted with power, with the resources and decision making, and how participation can really strengthen more inclusive and democratic societies, which obviously, as you all know, is the most important conversation that we can be having today. We're especially excited to hear from the perspectives of some of the leaders that are on this call. They're working across different regions and movements and institutional contexts, and they bring their unique experiences of participation, accountability, and collective power to this dialogue. So we want to move, before we move into the speaker reflections, I'm going to introduce a set of sort of guiding conversations, and then we've asked each of the speakers to reflect up to 5 minutes on those questions. And then after that, we're going to move into breakout conversations. We're going to break out into smaller rooms to have more intimate conversations and interaction, and then we'll have a collective reflection period afterwards where we can dialogue in plenary. Okay, so before we begin, we wanted to start off with a quick poll to understand where everybody in the room is in terms of their knowledge and understanding about the civic voice. The definition, the working definition that we're using for the civic voice is that civic voice is the ability of individuals and communities to express their views, influence decisions, and shape the systems that affect their lives. And that's not just by speaking, but by having their input meaningfully considered and acted upon. It includes formal structures like participatory grantmaking, citizen assemblies, voting, political elections, as well as voluntary actions, organizings, and protests. So if you see on your screen, a little poll was launched. We're going to give folks a minute or two to respond to the 3 questions that I believe are on the poll. And then we'll reflect a little bit on what the answers are in the group.
Thanks, Coco. As you can see on your screen, our poll is up and keep the answers coming through. But just so for other people who may not be able to see the poll, we are reflecting on 3 questions. And one is, how does civic voice compare to 30 years ago, between now and 30 years ago? And we have options. 1, it's stronger, it's about the same, and it's weaker. And I can see that we have a lot of optimists in the room, which is great. A lot of us are saying it's stronger right now. I mean, yes. And then the next question is, how comfortable do you feel with the idea that civic voice can lead to outcomes that you strongly disagree with? We have very comfortable, somewhat comfortable, and somewhat uncomfortable. We do. If you do not know, that is also fine. I think you can skip the question. But I appreciate the space for having diverse views. You don't have to necessarily have an answer. Our third question is, does PGM support civic and democratic participation, community connection, and belonging? And a lot of us are saying yes to a great extent, and yes, moderately. But we're not having no's yet, unless someone is about to answer with that. But I think these are great questions in terms of reflection of where we are in PGM, but also where we are at in the world. We're going to give it just 1 more minute as we wind up with our answers. Just 10 seconds for anyone who hasn't answered. I see we have about 91 responses, which is a great participation. But I'll be ending the poll in just a few seconds so we can continue with the conversation. Thanks everyone for participating. We'll probably share the reflections from the poll as well as we're sharing the slides and the resources from the conversation. Back to you, Coco.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for organizing this. What we really want is to have a dialogue and have interaction with us. So there'll be various moments, including after the speakers, for us to break out and to dive back into more of these conversations. But without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today. I want to give a warm welcome to Natasha, Melissa, Oleksandra, and Jidan. As I mentioned earlier, all of these speakers are leaders working in the intersection of participatory grantmaking, civic participation, and democratic practice. I'm going to give a short bio of each of them prior to when they speak, but their longer full bio will be shared on the screen through by Gloria. So I'm going to speak directly to the panelists right now. And I want to invite each of you to take 5 minutes to reflect on the following questions in your remarks. How does participation manifest in your field or work? We want to hear examples of participatory grant making, as well as broader forms of civic organization and civic organizing and participation beyond philanthropy. Secondly, how are shifts in the development and democracy landscape impacting participatory grant making and civic participation more broadly? And third, in a time of shrinking civic space and rising authoritarianism, how can participatory grant making help keep civic spaces open? And how do we ensure participatory models support liberation rather than reproduce exclusion or oppression? Well, I know also folks in the audience probably have some reflections on this. But first, we're going to listen to our panelists share their thoughts, and then we'll have an opportunity to dive into more conversation in the breakout sessions. So we're going to start with you, Natasha. Natasha has led Camden Giving since 2017, helping advance community-led funding and participatory grant making in the UK. She is also part of the Participatory Grantmaking Community of Practice and a Civic Futures Fellow, contributing to a wider conversations on democracy, participation, and philanthropy. Natasha, I hand the mic to you.
Thank you. It's so nice to be in this. I can't help but feel really optimistic that lots of people want to be part of this chat. It feels so incredibly needed. Yeah, I'm Natasha and I work at Camden Giving. We are a grant maker and our mission is to overcome inequality in the London Borough of Camden. And if you don't know London or Camden really well, it's a funny old place, Camden. It's full of money. It's dripping in money and business, and it has the highest poverty rate in London as well. So it's a real borough of divides. And I think I had a chat with a young Somali woman that lives in Camden. She was like 16 at the time. And I said to her, "What's that building that's being put up there?" And she said, "I don't know. I just know it's not for me." And I think that's what Camden feels like to a lot of people. It feels like this place where lots of money is being made, lots of great things are happening, lots of knowledge is being generated, but it is not open to everyone that is there. Both is literally not open, and it feels like it's not open. So our mission is to overcome inequality, and we've been cracking on with trying to do that for 9 years. And a couple of years ago, it became incredibly apparent to us that doing that by grant making seemed utterly ridiculous, if I'm honest. The scale of inequality and the fact that poverty has grown since Camden Giving has existed in Camden just felt like it felt silly to pretend we were doing it via grant making alone. We've always been a participatory grant maker. The staff and trustees at Camden Giving have never awarded grants, and we've worked with lots of people who are experiencing the issues that we're addressing in order to award our grants. And it's built up this amazing alumni of 800 plus people that have been involved in that grant making process. That's some of them, that's Evans, that have been involved in that grant making process along the way. And actually what we've started to think is the secret to unlocking inequality in Camden is not the grant money we're moving, it's the civic participation that we're engaging along the way with that. Partly because we think that hill is too high to climb alone, but we think that people, by becoming involved in participatory grant making, build hope in their own ability to influence systems. They are more likely to understand the structure of how power exists in the borough, and therefore more likely to go and set up their own work as volunteers or help a neighbour or challenge the local government if it's not doing what it's meant to be doing, and just be more involved in communities. That feels incredibly important. We particularly work with a large number of young people, a large number of people with disabilities, and a large number of people from the global majority. Camden is a borough of sanctuary, which means in practice in principle, it aims to be a borough that is welcoming to people that are seeking refugees from the rest of the world, but we're operating within within a UK government structure. So in practice, that doesn't always come to life. But Camden is a place that real rich migration, and therefore we're working with a lot of people that are both have lived in Camden for generations, but also people that in some cases have been in Camden with us for a few months and are now part of the community in Camden and grant making. So the people that are involved in our grant making are incredibly important. We just had local elections in the UK. They've been interesting for those of you that don't live in the UK, but the turnout for local elections in Camden is incredibly low. It's around 30% of people turn up to vote. And what's interesting is about half of the people that award grants with us tell us that they don't vote in local government elections either. So that means that they're not casting a ballot, but they are interested in community. They're interested in things happening, and we think that's really important. And we think participatory grant making is potentially a gateway into sort of a democracy that is more than just casting a vote. It's also attending protest. It's also helping a neighbour. It's also having conversations. I think one of the roles that participatory grant making is playing in supporting healthy democracy and healthy civic action is that we're facilitating spaces where people may not agree but still get things done together. And it never ceases to amaze me that people don't tend to disagree that much when it comes to participatory grant making. We're forever told that everyone disagrees with everyone else, and if you spent any time on X, you might feel that was the way the world is. But I spend lots of my time with people that have incredibly different experiences of life and are from really different backgrounds, and very rarely do they fall out. They always get to a point that they can agree on how money should be spent, even if it isn't exactly their preference. There's a willingness of humans to work as communities that shines through all the time. And I think building hope in our ability to do that and reminding people that exists is really important. The other role that I think we play is we live in a world of just people, sort of a no, I don't want to steal other people's words, but people talk about a post-truth world, and we're certainly seeing, in comparison to 9 years ago, a lot more people coming and having information that isn't true about the world and wanting to use that to make decisions. And I think that we all, as participatory grant makers, have a really important role of helping people to understand the truth in order to make change in communities. In the local elections in Camden recently, a candidate that very nearly was elected to local government, bar 150 votes, had said openly during his campaign that 9/11 was a Jewish conspiracy. And it's really important that participatory grant makers exist. And as we're doing anti-racist work, we're talking about the truths, and that if you're hearing this thing, you need to know that that's not true, and sort of saying that racism is a real thing, and kind of validating the truth, but also guiding people away from information that might not be true as well. I think I've probably gone on for more than 5 minutes already, Coco. So I'll wrap up there, but I'm really happy to chat more.
Thank you so much, Natasha. I am really struck by what you said, and I really kind of appreciate how you shared how Camden Giving's participatory grant-making programming has promoted civic engagement through truth-telling, connection, community, skill sharing, I heard, seeding and supporting local movements, and advancing democracy beyond just voting. And I think that that's really like, these are kind of the invisible threads, I think, that are really the strongest connections of building civic engagement. It's not just getting out the vote. And I think that that's really, you really articulated that very clearly. Let's move on to our next panelist, Melissa. Melissa is the program manager for People Powered and manages the global capacity building programs of that organization, supporting governments and organizations to strengthen their participatory democracy, digital participation, and civic engagement. She brings experience across civic tech, digital democracy, and policy through previous work with the Civic Tech Innovation Network, Code for All, and CIP ESA. which is the collaboration on international ICT policy for East and Southern Africa. Melissa, you have the mic.
Thanks. It's always so strange to hear someone read your bio. So it's like, oh. Thank you. I had a couple of slides, but I think I might just do without them because this feels more like an open conversation and less slides kind of event. But I'm always happy to share the slides with everyone afterwards. So yeah, thank you, Coco, and thank you, Gloria, for the invitation. My name is Melissa. I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa. We just came out of a really big storm for the last couple of days. So it's quite hectic. Yay, climate change. So I think the core of the question that I'm here to be answering is from the civic participation side of things, which is basically, does democracy still matter in our day and age? And for me, the answer is a very much easy yes. Democracy is still a better system for our society. Even with its current and ongoing challenges, democracy remains, I would say, a better choice because I think it's inclusive, it's adaptable, it's transparent, and it's accountable. And I think it's a bit more capable of building a better society for the majority instead of the minority. And of course, it still has its real, very, very real frustrations that we see going on all over the world. And we acknowledge those. But I think with democracy, we can still build systems that are functional, that serve the majority, if they're designed well, of course. It's all about the design and whether we are willing to embrace new strategies for renewing, adapting, and expanding our democracy and the way we practice democracy, so to say. And from my background at People Powered, we come from a background of participatory democracy, which is basically participatory and deliberative democracy, which aims to empower people to collaborate with governments in decision-making in processes that affect their lives. So allowing people to actually be part of the decision-making processes for issues that affect their daily lives. And we find that participatory democracy approaches can be used to shift power and engage broader communities in decision-making. But I want to say that we have to remember that democracy is not just, something that happens. It's something that it needs planning, it needs design, it needs support, it needs engagement, and it needs funds, which is something we don't openly talk about. And it needs action from everyone, including our citizens. There is no democracy without our citizens. Even though it might be that it's backsliding, we actually need to push against that because that's how autocracy, succeeds because it relies on apathy and, people believing that nothing will change. We actually need to be engaged citizens for us to benefit from the democracy that we want. So that would be my opening statement about democracy. And I think what we at People Powered find is organizations and governments around the world are very much open to participatory democracy. However, they frequently struggle to plan and implement participatory democracy processes because they're unfamiliar with the approaches or they don't have the right resources, especially when it comes to perhaps engaging marginalized and historically excluded communities. So we help these organizations and governments in addressing these challenges so that they can do and think about democracy better in a way that actually fits their own local communities and challenges. And that's how we help them. We expand people's power to make government decisions by supporting the organizations and governments that are actually building participatory democracy on the ground. So it's not just talk and, in our fancy offices and so forth. And when we are talking about, in practice, what we mean by participatory democracy, we are talking about things like participatory budgeting, citizen assemblies, legislative theater. We're talking about participatory planning and policy making. And this is because we don't believe there is one way of doing participatory democracy. We believe that there is many approaches, many unique approaches that can be localized to participation because our societies are unique, they're different, they're also similar, but we have to adapt how we practice democracy to the context and for the issue that we are trying to address. These are just some of the examples of some of the work that we've been doing. And our most, which is what I'm here to actually talk about, our most comprehensive support in this way is our accelerators, where we offer support to these organizations and governments to actually support them in designing an action plan for participatory democracy project. And then they get a year to implement that. And we typically support about 12 to 30 participants in each cohort. And these are usually partnerships between governments and civil society organizations. And this is because we truly believe that participatory democracy can only work if these two sides are working together to actually implement the participatory project. And our work is usually across thematic focuses, for example, climate action, inclusion, digital democracy, or mainstreaming participation. We have one on democratic innovations in Europe. So sometimes they're particularly focused on one region, depending on that region's needs. And so far, we've trained at least I would say over 1,500 democracy advocates and governments around the world, and supported over 170 participatory government programs around the world, from Zimbabwe to India to Mexico to Brazil to Poland. We have been supporting people in implementing better democracies, as I would put it, so that it's not just we're not letting our governments and these SEOs figure it out by themselves, so that they have a community of practitioners that can help them figure out how do you actually implement a participatory democracy in your context. And then I think our role in this space, especially in the participatory grant making space, is to offer practical and globally tested insights on how participatory grant making and civic action intersect to create more, I would say, equitable funding ecosystem, especially for democracy. Like I said, democracy requires funds. And our work bridges theory and action. So it's not just, something that we write in a document and we leave it. And we focus a lot more on inclusive decision making, power shifting, and community-led solutions. And that's why we do those accelerators to ensure that the action plans these people develop are actually rooted in their community needs and issues. And I think in terms of this grant making space, there's a movement, as you can see from here, from like grantors or funders that are actually centering their grant making practices on, participatory grant making principles. And some foundations that we work with are transforming their processes and shifting towards more direct grantee participation in the grant making processes in an effort, I guess, to transfer decision making power to the communities that are actually affected and need the funds to improve their communities. And we at People Powered have supported and collaborated some of these funders and some of these communities in adopting participatory processes and practices in their decision-making and grant-making processes. And this is something that we can replicate for other funders that are interested in adopting this kind of process. So if you are curious, feel free to reach out to me. So we're very much interested in helping funding organizations create participatory processes and embed participatory processes in their existing programs, because maybe just doing participatory grant making might not make sense. So how do you do it without disrupting your entire system, right? And another thing is we're very well versed in using digital participation tools in participatory grant making processes, because digital tools are now playing a bigger role, I would say, in participatory democracy, especially with improving the processes to make them more efficient, inclusive, and accessible, and all those things. So if you're curious, please do feel free to reach out to me. And we actually do have a call for applications for one of our accelerators. I'll share the link in the chat just now. And thank you. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you for that very quick introduction about how People Powered is strengthening participatory democracy through really being innovative. I was taking notes when you said redesigning, renewing, adapting, expanding strategies to engage communities in decision-making and democracy. And I love how you uplifted how building meaningful participation does not always happen automatically. It takes resources, investment, trust, capacity building, infrastructure and those strategies and a real commitment to sharing power so that communities can meaningfully engage to shape the policies and the systems and the futures that impact them. So I think that is really a really great introduction to People Powered. I heard at the very end that you have a open call happening too, so please share that also on the chat box, and we will move on to our next speaker. Oleksandra is the program manager for Frida, the Young Feminist Fund. Oleksandra leads the Participatory Grantmaking initiative at Frida, supporting young feminist-led groups around the world through flexible funding approaches with over a decade of experience across philanthropy and international development. Her work is grounded in the feminist values and collective care and grassroots movement building. I noticed her photo is not on the slide there, but you can see her in person. There you are. Oleksandra, I hand the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Coco. I am actually excited to be a little bit on the other side of it, more on a side of grant making. And this is, I'll share a couple of slides just to structure my 5 minutes. Today, I'm very pleased to talk on behalf of Frida, and Frida is a youth-led fund. We are participatory grant maker. We've been here for slightly over than 15 years, and we believe truly that young women, girls, trans folks, gender non-conforming youth should be recognized as experts of their own reality, and therefore participatory approaches is the only way forward, as we see. We do grant making and we do other work in a different formats and ways, but we believe in resourcing young feminists and contributing to strengthening leadership opportunities. But this is something that you can find everywhere. So I'll move to the questions that were asked for us today, and the parts that I wanted a little bit to reflect with all of you and to share on how participation manifests in our work. Like my first initial thought after hearing Natasha and Melissa is that participation manifests in such different ways and in such different forms, and in different contexts it might mean something different. So in context of Frida work, participation is something that helps us to shift power, to shift focus, and also to have this power to shape the outcomes and results. We believe in funding collectives, not just projects, and this is what we do through multi-year flexible core funding. And a couple of examples how we approach the things in participatory grant making is something we piloted last year, which was community-led call for applications, where community nominated applicants to be considered for funding. And something that we practice from very start of Frida is a peer voting. It's a process when those who applied vote for fellow activists in their regions, in their thematics, and choose who would receive the funding. And this is a beautiful part that it's not upon Frida staff, for example, to make that decision, but it's community who knows the best way, and it's community who should hold this decision-making power. Another way of how participation is introduced is through self-identified priorities, which each and every grantee partner decides on their own how they want to use this grant, and this is about flexible multi-year funding, right? And then what are their needs and goals for their capacity strengthening. We can be there to support, but we are not there to decide what needs to be done. And of course, those more kind of accompaniment parts of the work, learning spaces throughout which grantee partners can shape their journey, can request specific discussions, can look into networking opportunities and into collaborating with fellow activists from their regions or beyond if it comes to different thematics, for example. So those are the ways how participation can manifest in grant making, and it has honestly no limits. Thinking more in regards to today's reality, indeed there are so many changes, and this is like just a brief part of what we all faced, and this goes towards many funding imbalances and how the world becomes more intersectional, and the work of activists on ground becomes also very intersectional. There is constant shift in priorities, and there are a lot of issues with restrictions that are imposed more and more often towards civil society and towards activists. And of course, there is uncertainties that guide us to short-term funding opportunities. But if we would look beyond funding just projects, then there is a strong need to refocus attention on risk prevention work, on addressing emergencies, and this is what many funders found opportunities to do, and a lot of our sister funds managed to find different creative approaches to support activists in their challenged, fast-pacing environments. There is a lot of shift going towards safety and security concerns and protection. And of course, there is a shift towards collective care and well-being. Although it's not enough, in a way, in my personal opinion, it's not enough, and we do need to invest into collective care. And going towards the last question, I thought a little bit of what Melissa just mentioned, that a lot of things are not automatic. And indeed, that was my feeling reflecting back on what is participatory grant making. And while we hope that it's a practice of democracy, care, and liberation, it's not automatic at all. And everything requires action, everything requires a lot of efforts. And here are some thoughts around what we can do in our respective contexts as organizations or as individuals. And this would include reimagining leadership, because leadership is a bravery space. It requires a lot from us. And it should not be a leadership of exhaustion, of burnout, but more rooted in trust and accountability. It's about reimagining how we do our monitoring evaluation and going beyond and further to find this more as a learning practice, as a practice to improve rather than a practice of control. It's about understanding that our communities are not homogeneous, and therefore we need to invest time into participation. We need to find ways how we can make the space as just as possible. And of course, invest in the well-being, because well-being is indeed a political infrastructure. And care is something that is strongly underfunded within today's reality. And when we're looking into civic participation and civic action, when everyone feels under weather, let's say, they don't have energy to do it. We are all activists in our context, right? And then at the moments when we are at our lows, when our security or safety is not safe and secure, when we are in a position of need for mental or physical health, then only when those needs are fulfilled, we can move forward, we can find more creative power, we can find more action in it. And this is where I think that well-being cannot be separated from the justice work, is integral part, probably one of the fundamental parts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Oleksandra. I really appreciate how you were talking about Frida, a sister fund of ours, how their civic engagement is grounded in that collective care, safety, holistic security. It cannot be more important than it is right now for obvious reasons. And in this context of the funding shifts, like the funding for care and well-being is sometimes deprioritized, as is funding for participation writ large. So for supporting organizations to take the time and effort to engage with community is not high up on the list. But I love how that you kind of weaved in how Frida invests in emergency support, risk prevention, accompaniment, capacity building, and helps groups navigate fluctuating contexts, but also be able to be more sustainable with their flexible core funding model. So I think that this like really reflects like a really deep understanding and alignment within the institution that like movement building, civic engagement is very, very taxing, and that we need to support not only the movements that are doing the important rights-based work, but how they do it. And we need to support the individuals through intentional care. So I think that's a really, really important part of this conversation, that what we do and how we do is both equally important, and we need to support both ends of that. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on to our last speaker, Jidan, who is the head of ecosystem engagement for the One Project. Jidan leads ecosystems at the One Project, supporting community-led systems change and regenerative economic approaches. With roots in grassroots organizing and racial and economic justice movements, her work focuses on philanthropy that is accountable to communities and social movements. Jidan, please take the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. It's the morning where I am, and so there's a bunch of getting ready for school in the background. So just if you're hearing a lot of stuff, there's activity. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super humbled to be amongst the colleagues on this panel, because I feel like One Project, we're kind of in our baby steps on moving towards democratized resource allocation, and we've learned so much from all of you. Actually, we did a bunch of desk research and then had the honor of funding, and also being I feel like People Powered has definitely built our capacity for participatory grant making, which I will talk a little bit more about. So if I could just, I'm going to run through the slides really quickly. I feel like folks might not be that familiar with One Project. We're about 6 years old. The first 3 years was really kind of a think tank phase. And then the last 3 years is on the trajectory of work that I'm going to be describing. So our mission is to advance something that we call economic democracy. And this is what participation means to us. It's very similar to, participatory policymaking that People Powered talked about, but it's about where the people actually steward the different resources to meet our community's needs. So it's a way of talking about political democracy and economic ownership and mashing it together, because I think what we're seeing is that you can't have political democracy without democratizing the structure of ownership. So when you look at somewhere like the United States, which is like the territory that I'm most familiar with, we have consolidation of wealth in fewer and fewer billionaires and corporations. And then they basically buy the political system. And then the political system that is supposedly a political democracy, you get elections that are being stolen, you get all the lobbyists, and they are producing policy that basically, gives them tax breaks and like further calcifies and widens the wealth and the income gap. So that's our main thesis, is that you can't have political democracy without economic democracy. And so that's why we are focusing our funding and our work on really furthering this intersection of ownership and decision-making over assets with like collective decision-making and collective stewardship. Next slide. So there are 3 strategic initiatives that we're working on. One is building technological infrastructure that hopefully makes it less burdensome for communities to engage in group decision making. The second one is called Common Action, and that's our grant making work to fund the folks that are changing the rules. And then the third one is Common Sense, and that's really about communications around why participatory approaches are more effective, like Coco was saying. Like, what happens when the people who have the experience are given decision-making power, because then they can bring their wisdom and their solutions to bear. Next slide. So in terms of the first one, the Common Platform, we just launched this in June of 2025. We've ran several pilots. Again, People Powered was such a amazing teacher for us, and they were one of the pilots. And so we've supported group decision-making processes. We ourselves began to go on a trajectory of like, we can't just fund the work. We have to reignite our own democratic capacity and embracing of democratic resource allocation. So we've run our own internal first participatory grant making process last year. And then I'll talk more about how we're evolving our grant making practice. And then we're beginning this next in 2026. We have a healthy waterway of groups that are piloting Common as their decision-making platform. And we've had the first cities kind of sign on to pilot the platform with us. Next slide. So Common Action on our work for grant making. This is our trad to rad journey, trad being traditional. So we are single donor resourced. It was staff-led grant making, but it's also, like we feel pretty proud because, we went from more single year to multi-year, to unrestricted. We fund power building. We went from 70% white male-led grantees to majority people of color and frontline community-led grantee groups. So it's like we've been in our journey, and we really feel like our next hurdle is to actually embody democratic practice. So we're evolving to a pooled fund structure where we can activate multiple donors. And particularly our founder and main donor is a technologist. And we believe that he's uniquely positioned to really carry this message to other tech wealth holders. And then it'll be allocated via a practitioner committee. But we do envision it getting increasingly democratic over time. But this is a developmental process, the letting go of power. So this is the work that I lead. And then the third thing is this communications work. So it is about like putting out research that talks about like, why is this work more effective? When you look at impact and solutions, and we believe that there could be the evidence is out there. I think that we just haven't had the resources and the research institutions to really like put the evidence together and rigorously test it and communicate it out. So we're trying to fill some of that gap. And then this is just like our dreams for the future. So this stuff is not in play yet, but for this pooled fund that we're building, and this functionality probably won't be all built out for another 2 years or so. But we wanted to be able to use the Common Platform in order to really like transform how pooled funds work. You can stop the slides now. So that's a little bit about who we are and what we're doing. I think just going back to like the political landscape right now. So if you look at the structure of power and who has the resources, like, there's this many resources and more of it is owned by the top, like 0.05%. That means there's less resources, both in the public sector as well as like available for community control and collective stewardship. So I think that's where participatory grant making, where you have wealth holders or foundations that believe in deep democracy, like the role of participatory grant making is even more important, because as our political institutions get less and less democratic, like participatory grant making becomes a way that communities can keep the practice and capacity of community stewardship alive. And I think somebody, maybe it was Natasha, somebody was saying at the beginning that communities have an innate desire to govern collectively. And that is, I believe it's part of like, many of our indigenous ways of being is about like collective stewardship of many, of home, of water, of land. And as the current economic system has unfolded and more wealth is being consolidated and owned by fewer and fewer people, that our capacity to actually do that together is getting less and less. And so we just look for where's the opportunity for us to reawaken that within ourselves. And like our sister from Frida Fund was saying, it takes a lot of capacity, to relearn how to engage in direct democracy, to work through conflict together, to unlearn and get past scarcity and trauma with money. So, all of that work and the time it takes to build the relationships and trusts to actually negotiate with each other, like all of that needs to be funded. And it takes longer, but it's like that's how you get to actually the root of the problem. I think I'll keep it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jidan. I'm so glad we're jumping into our next session where we're going to do breakout rooms, because there was so much that you talked about here about how the One Project is doing all these amazing things to kind of connect people and to address the systems and platforms. And there's a lot of things there, but I also particularly appreciate how you were talking about economic democracy and how economic and political democracy are deeply linked, especially when concentrated wealth shapes or distorts all of our political systems. And so I think that just really uplifting how strengthening democracy is about redistributing power, and participatory grantmaking is also about redistributing power, and how we're addressing ownership is also incredibly meaningful for economic and political life. I know that you said this much, much more coherently than I'm saying it. I also really heard when you were talking about how internally within your own organization, there's work about becoming more democratic itself within our own governance system. So as we're speaking about the work that we're doing kind of externally, all of us within our own institutions are also sometimes facing challenges and growth pains, trying to democratize the way that we work. And within philanthropy, that is obviously something that is really a struggle sometimes. So I think that you kind of also raised that's also part of the approach that you're working on. So, but thank you to all of our four speakers for really, really starting off this conversation with a lot of like meat for us to engage in. We are going to dive now into our breakout groups. We're going to have 3 breakout groups, I believe, Gloria. And the purpose of the breakout space is for us to just really have more of a close conversation, a deeper conversation about what resonates most for us from the conversations that we've heard, and what are we seeing in terms of our own examples and the work that we all are doing and expertise we have engaging in our own personal and professional lives. What challenges do we see faced with civic participation or participatory practice in our own contexts, and what are the opportunities? So this is the kind of prompting for the conversation. We're hoping that we can reflect back afterwards and in a plenary session. So if you can identify someone who would be willing to do that, that'd be great. And I'll give it to Gloria now to do the breakout rooms.
Thanks so much, Coco. And thanks everybody for sharing all about your amazing work. I think it's great to learn and see the different connecting dots across the issues that we're working on: economic democracy, civic participation, PGM, and it's such a powerful conversation. Coco, I wanted to uplift something because I can see that some folks are jumping off for other meetings, and I was wondering if perhaps we want to get into like a smaller Q&A before we get to the breakout rooms.
I'm
That might
seeing
be,
the time too. So we have
yeah,
about 20 more minutes for the session. So should we just stay in a group?
I think so. Perhaps,
Sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, so maybe we can stay in a plenary and then we can open it up for Q&A. Would we prefer to do that? Okay, yes. Of course, time is not always on our favor, so let's do it in that approach. Can we there's a lot in the chat. Is there anyone who wants to raise their hand before we look through the chat and ask the panelists any questions? I'm trying to see. I can't see all the pages, but please unmute yourself if you have a question to start off. Does anyone have a question?
I saw a question in the chat earlier. I think it was for Melissa around what is your experience in differences in working with collaborative welfare development between countries with strong public welfare and countries with more diverse systems of welfare?
Oh my, is that for me? That's a serious question.
It came up, I think, right after you're speaking, but if anyone feels called to answer it.
Let me give that a thought before I answer, if I have an answer.
As Melissa thinks through, and feel free to jump in, either Natasha, Oleksandra, or Jidan, if this question resonates. But I just wanted to also remind folks, feel free to unmute. A lot of love came from the chat as well about the One Project platform. If you want to share a reflection around that, feel free. But we want to hear from everyone's perspectives and views. And if you have something that you would like to raise to a specific speaker or to really uplift from the conversation, feel free. And I see a question from Lina. What has been your experience with moving forward, engaging communities in PGM who hadn't had this experience before of grant making?
Maybe Natasha, you can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I can. And just to say that the people that grant make with us are not particularly activists, or they probably wouldn't describe themselves as community leaders, although there's a both, but we're all on a spectrum. Obviously, they're regular people. They are people that have lived experience of the issues that we're addressing, and I think particularly talking about this in terms of their civic participation. In 2018, there were very sadly 3 murders in one night in Camden, and they particularly hit upon young men. And we brought together a group of young men to do some grant making with us to award grants, partly because we knew youth services needed to be funded better as a response, but partly because we felt young people needed to have power to be able to take back their own safety and agency in communities. And we worked with this group over months. We were with them a lot. They were spent a lot of evenings together eating pizza and talking about what they wanted Camden to be like and what was needed, and with the ultimate aim that there was a set amount of money and they were going to award grants for it. And then we got to the bit and they'd got their applications and they'd reviewed them. And then at the very end, one of the young men said, "When will we find out if these grants will be awarded or not?" And we thought we'd been very clear that that was the decision they were making there and then. And I think it sort of feels relevant because I think he was so used to not having a voice and not being listened to and not being civically active that it felt automatic that some grown up in a glass building that wasn't for him would rubber stamp or not rubber stamp that decision, and maybe we'd let him know and maybe we wouldn't, because that had been his experience in so many places. And I think sort of I'm not sure that fully answers the question, but the need to grow trust and to grow hope and to grow agency, that when people are treated in a way where their voices are not heard or not respected, that they feel confident to challenge that in the future. And that sort of is the hope I have for that young man going forward, that the next time someone doesn't listen to him, he goes, hang on a second. And I think there are many building blocks for making that happen along a process of working with people.
Thank you for that, Natasha. I see there's some more questions on the chat. Maybe I'll read out some of them. There's a question from Rochelle about advice about ethically recruiting community panels, making sure those who might be historically excluded are included in a non-extractive way. That's a really great question. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? Oleksandra, I saw some head nods.
I'm thinking how this is a complex issue, and I bet everyone who've ever experienced working with different panels tried their best. I would honestly say it's very challenging to ensure 100%, but the will should be always there, and it should not be like an excuse to the difficulty of the process to be an excuse for not trying more. Something we tried out, it was as a part of grant making, but also as a part of working with the Frida advisory, is to ask community directly, and that would be a brilliant way of asking those who are the closest to the issue, closest to the situation. Of course, there are some voices might be muted intentionally or unintentionally, and that is where the challenge comes from. But I would say outreach, that would be a very needed act, and this outreach needs to be just in a way of language, for example. That would be one of the aspects that is usually excluding, and through the word of mouth, that you go to the community, you go to organizations you have always or ever or at least once collaborated with, and then you just ask for their advice. And you might be surprised how much knowledge can be within this room, within any room that we enter. So I would say asking community for their advice, and being ready that this advice might not be pleasant, and might be challenging. Yeah, that would be one. And second thing would be also to understand what is the strategy there, what is the goal there. Why do we need to involve, and who do we need to involve? Because sometimes we have 5 priorities, but we cannot complete all of 5, right? So we need to focus on some things, and this prioritization is painful and unpleasant experience, but it requires of us to make sometimes these decisions, and to ensure that things are moving forward, and still try our best to make the just in language, in accessibility, in tools or ways, offering alternative ways to join, for example. For some folks, it might be comfortable to join in person. For some folks, it's uncomfortable to be on call. For some folks, it would be easier to write their mind and then speak their mind. So it could be in very different ways, and acknowledging that needs are different would be one of the ways forward.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. I think getting out of the bubble and making sure that you're actually including the excluded groups that might not be in the community, but yeah, through nominations and speaking to people, I think that's brilliant. Thank you so much.
I see another question about funding. And so I want to ask the panel about what approaches have actually worked in building trust with funders? And what does it take really to secure support, not just for our grant making, but for PGM itself? So how do we support the building of this infrastructure that makes participatory grant making possible and sustainable? I know this is a question for the accountability circle that's on the table right now. Like, funders love the outcomes of participatory grant making. They love the concept of framing, but it's very hard to get them to actually support our work to actually do this. And we all know that engaging with community requires investment, requires time, requires resources, it requires a lot, and it's hard to get funding for that.
Perhaps I can try venture an answer. I think the first thing I would be curious about is the openness of the funder themselves in this kind of process. Because I think it's very difficult to convince people of something that they were never interested in to begin with, right? Showing them evidence that this works as well is something that we could try, because there's a lot, I think, from one project, from the other presenters, from this community alone, there's a lot of evidence that this works. And I think if we go back in history, we'll find further evidence that this actually works. And the way philanthropy eventually evolved was not actually maybe natural to how we did things in the past. So I venture there's a lot of evidence out there that we can use. I think, philanthropies love evidence. They love to see like those tangible, real numbers and all that. But we also have to challenge our thinking when it comes to this. Like perhaps we don't need the numbers. We need other kinds of evidence or impact to show that the work that we're doing actually matters, and that requires an openness to that conversation so that we can all get to a point where we can agree, as we were talking about disagreements earlier. I think that would be my first point.
Jidan?
I'm sharing this from like a fellow traveler, because I think this exact question is very alive for us as well. And from our like a piece of our approach internally was the funder education stuff, but also like how do we start with smaller, maybe like what feels like low stakes practices, so like we did, our beginning smaller participatory grant round as a way for us to build institutional capacity and learning about participatory grant making, so that it's like a little stepping stone to like, okay, can we put more of our resources towards a more democratized like allocation method. And then as we've been trying to go to like fundraise for this pooled fund, we've been noodling on and would love to hear from, I see folks are like, we want to share our experience. I want to hear it. But like because participation is transformative, right? Because that's what we believe. And so it's like the donors, it's not simply saying cede power and leave it over there and go into your own room. It's like, how is their participation changing? So it's not that they don't participate, but the nature of their participation is changing. It's not as the final decision maker, but what's the alternative participation that's going to be transformative as they are maybe walking and learning alongside the participatory grant making process. So that's our inquiry right now.
I noticed there are some folks from the chat that say they want to share back about their experience. Is there anyone who wants to make a 1-minute reflection on this? If so, please speak up. Nope. I do have maybe a final question for the panelists. And this is kind of an expansive question, but what are some of the biggest tensions and trade-offs that you have encountered in this work when trying to shift power in grant making or civic processes? And how are you or your institutions trying to navigate those in practice?
don't mind chipping in, and just saying, I think one of the biggest challenges is that very often people that we're grant making with have so much potential to be really brilliant community leaders, but are often facing so many barriers. It's not that there's one thing in their way. They might not be economically active, they might be caring, there's a whole pile of complicated layers to their lives. And I think the way that we're approaching that, and it may well not be the right approach, and it's certainly proving challenging to scale, is that we'll just always be there for them and always help them unpick those things. We never say goodbye to people, and they form part of this big alumni that are quite actively involved in that. But we're only a little team, and there's a lot more of those people than there are of us. So it's been quite difficult to scale, but we're trying to always be the first point of call for people if they need us going forward, so that we can help unpick those many barriers that stand in their way to help them be civically active.
I can try and give a short answer. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face, especially as people that are engaged in participatory democracy, is, I guess, what we are calling the narratives around democracy, because everyone has real frustrations around democracy. So everyone's quick answer is it doesn't work. We should change to something else, right? And we're very committed to this work. So we are also trying to change those narratives around democracy and how democracy actually works. And making sure that the people that need to hear about democracy and how it could actually enable or empower them to have a voice in decision making, get that message, get to participate in their communities. So that there is that. There's also, we find in our programs, especially when we are supporting governments and SEOs around the world in implementing programs, there is an issue with funding and sustaining that work further, because it's not democracy is not free. We need governments need to ensure that their funds, SEOs that are engaged in the work need the funds to sustain the work. And we have this issue where, it becomes a one-off activity instead of a continuous institutionalized activity that's part of our communities. So that's also a big problem. And I think there's other problems that especially our participants face, which is like political issues. For example, if they're implementing a participatory process and the government changes, sometimes that disrupts the entire democracy system that they were developing, So we have a lot of these internal issues and, that we face as an organization, but a lot of the issues are also faced by our participants that we're trying to support in actually implementing better democracies around the world. And those are just from the top of my mind, but I imagine there's a lot more that we are facing.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists want to, Oleksandra?
Yep. I tried to think of one, and full page of my notebook is already filled. I'm thinking that fastly emerging changes, that is one of the biggest issues that we face. One day, all good. Next day, ultra-right movements are taking over. One day we are at good place, another day someone makes awful decision, and then countries, regions, and humans are affected. So adapting so fast, especially with participatory approach, is very challenging. As participation I mentioned, it takes time. It takes efforts, and it also takes efforts from the communities to be able to participate. So in this fast pacing thing, a lot of things get lost in translation, and you need to act. And you need to act mindful, and you need to act with care. And that the issue that comes from there is huge lack of trust, and it goes in many ways. And unfortunately, even when you think that trust is built there, it might break any second, and there are plenty of reasons behind it. I want to say that another and last challenge that I'm naming is advocacy for collective care and well-being. This is something that been a friction and a struggle. It seems like everyone understands the need, but it's not emergent need. It's not the need of today. It's not the need that would solve a problem immediately. It's not a challenge to be solved, but it's something in the background. It's something that kind of comes with layers of years of struggle, and then at one day it might pop. And that the problem is to not like allow that to go to that moment of this like crisis popping. And therefore, I think that that would be one of the things that could be tackled. Yeah. Thank you, Coco, for the question.
Oleksandra. Natasha, do you have a 10-second reflection?
Oh, sorry, I'm not sure. No.
Okay.
I don't think I can follow that.
Okay, well, thank you. I know we're coming on time, so I just want to say thank you to our speakers today, Melissa, Natasha, Jidan, and Oleksandra, for your really thought-provoking reflections. And thank you to all of you for taking the time and effort to join us. We could have been in conversation the entire day on this. This is how important it was. And these conversations, we really need to continue working on them. We need to continue engaging and dissecting this, particularly at this time where civic spaces are shrinking in many parts of the world. So thank you so much for that. We'll be sharing the webinar recording and additional resources to all of the participants. And before I close, I want to make a quick pitch for the participatory grant-making community. As Gloria mentioned in the beginning, it's a thriving community of more than 2,000 people. If you're not on the listserv, please join it. 73 countries. We've been launched now 6 years ago. And yeah, we have a participatory governance model and accountability circle. We're trying to, have direct community-led leadership and the actual practitioners working directly at the heart of participatory practice around the world who are engaged. So it's very late in the day here in Amsterdam, so sorry, mumbling my words. So if you are able to contribute, Natasha here, who is, Catherine. Say hi, Catherine. She is leading our fundraising efforts. We need this work to keep going and growing. So this community is currently fundraising to support our program and event costs and accessibility measures. As Gloria mentioned before, we have the Start Well scholarships, and we really need to invest in the overall sustainability of this work, as was mentioned through this conversation. So if you're able to contribute, please support the community through the Open Collective page. The link is on the chat. Talk to Catherine over there. She's really awesome and friendly and is working so hard to support the sustainability of this work. And yeah, so if you're also interested in deepening your participatory grant making work and practice, join the Start Well Learning cohort. There's information on the chat about this, and then also reach out to any of us. So thank you for your time and participation and for the extra 2 minutes on your day. And please, yes, stay engaged and involved. And thank you again for your interest and support. Bye.
Thank you.
Everyone, thank you so much, Coco, for steering this conversation. It's been truly insightful. Have a lovely time, everyone. Bye-bye.